It's become a running joke to not eat cafeteria food because, well, it's not good, but it used to be. And how can better institutional food be part of the solution for other problems? Joshna Maharaj explores those issues in her latest book, Take Back the Tray, Revolutionizing Food in Hospitals, Schools, and Other Institutions. She is a chef, food activist, podcast host, and more. And Joshna Maharaj joins us now from Toronto. Hi, so nice to meet you.
Hello, lovely to meet you too. It's
What
lovely to
can't
be
you
here.
do? What can't you do?
How you are sweet.
Maybe move
That
into
is
my
super
home
nice.
so you
I
can,
can't grow.
you
Let me
can,
tell you something. One thing I'm not good at, growing plants. I have tried.
I
None
can
of
do
these are
that.
growing.
Maybe
I
we can
cannot. I
exchange
don't have that
skills.
to-do. I like that a lot.
Well, it's become a running joke that don't eat the food in the cafeteria.
Yeah.
Hospital food is so bad. Why is it so bad?
The A lot of people think that the reason is because of money, and we've decided not to spend money on this. And while that is true, I think that the more real and interesting bit of truth here is that the reason this food in institutions is so bad is because nobody with any power really cares to do it differently. And that's just not good enough for me, right?
But
That's not a good enough answer considering how terrible it is. It just doesn't fit.
but what does it say about us that we just accepted it and it's become a punchline?
It is, well, I think that it is, I think it's a mirror of our greater societal relationship with food, right? We really have a low priority relationship with food. We don't take food seriously enough. And what we're seeing with institutional food is just sort of that context's manifestation of this bit of truth, right? We don't take food seriously enough. We don't understand the role that food actually plays in keeping our bodies well and healthy and alive. And that is the space narrow.
Is hospital food, institutional food, is it bad everywhere?
It is mostly bad everywhere. The places where it's not so bad are predictable. Places like Denmark, Copenhagen, Scandinavia, right, or have some really, thoughtful ideas about it. And places like Japan, right, hospital trays in Japan are like a dream sequence. They're so beautiful and thoughtful. They're interesting. They understand that somebody sort of stuck in a bed for a while needs a bunch of tiny little things and time to, they have the time to pour over a beautiful meal. They've really understood the full experience of mealtime, particularly in a hospital.
When we talk about Ontario, has institutional food always been this way?
No. And that is another really important wealth here for me, right? Is understanding that, like, for instance, when I was at the hospital in Scarborough, in the fridge, the walk in fridge, there were still these big giant meat hooks hanging from the ceiling. And when I asked about them, the staff who worked there remembered a time where sides of beef would come in and that they would do this on-site butchery. Can you imagine the idea of on-site butchery, fresh rolls in the morning, and 5 cooks in charge of making vegetables, right? That's the story that I got. So the wisdom here is that we once knew how to do this. We once thought that this was important. And then life happened, different pressures showed up. We responded to budgets the way we have. And we have decided to allow this to take a turn. We have decided that paying humans to stand at a counter on site and cook food is simply too expensive. And that to me is really empowering because we can just decide to do something differently, right? It's not like this is something imposed upon us. It's our system and we built it and we did this, so we can choose to do something else.
Well, you do write about that experience at Scarborough General Hospital
Mm.
in Toronto. And you also write, this isn't just my work, it's personal. How is it personal?
Yeah, well, if anybody that you love ends up in the hospital and you see the tray that they are offered, it is so disappointing and heartbreaking and disrespectful. And there's a story in there about my own dad. When he was in the hospital getting a pacemaker put in, and his tray came, and it was very dismal sort of scenario, and he actually did a double take on the lid, looking at me, being like, "So you haven't really got here yet, have you?" And when I see my people and my people's children, and I see they send me photos of the food that they're being served at school or what they're encountering when they've dropped their kid off at university, it doesn't feel right. This is not good, right? We should not be allowing ourselves and our community and our family and our friends to be treated this way. It is such a disrespect, and I don't think that any of us really have our eyes focused on that piece.
You mentioned patient trays. You write in the book that patient trays reflect the values of reflect the values of the institution serving them. What did you mean by
Yes.
that?
Well, this angle really comes to me from my perspective in hospitality, right? Because I'm a chef and a cook, hospitality is a really important sort of guiding principle. And when I talk about hospitality, I mean the relationship between a guest and a host. Very simply, that's what this is. And so any plate of food comes with the sort of the energy and the intention that produced that food, right? For example, the toasted bagel with cream cheese that you get in the drive-through comes with the attitude and the focus that is about quick, tasty, cheap, and can be delivered through a window, right? All of those boxes get checked. And so the attitude that offers up a plate of food in a hospital says, this is as far as we're going to go for you, right? We are not putting any more effort into this besides buying this very cheap, very nutritionally empty, very easy for us to produce meal. Right? This is where our limit is. And from a hospitality perspective, it's terrifying. And I want more people to recognize the fact that we're not fooling anybody, right? These terrible meals are not fooling anybody. There's no nutrition and no thoughtful, positive intention about wellness or learning or rehabilitation, even if we think about prisons. It's just a really conflicting and mixed message.
And you also say that most of that food ends up in the garbage anyway.
Well, there it is. I mean, that's really what got the fire inside of me about this. If this system where we let accountants make decisions about how we feed patients was working, and patients were doing well and eating food and thriving, I probably wouldn't have the same sort of anger and objections that I do. But on an anecdotal basis, we're talking about almost 40% of the food that gets put on a tray just takes a long road back to landfill, right? And it's important to remember that it's landfill because the infection control requirements in a hospital mean that nothing can be repurposed, right? And once it leaves, it can never come back in. And to me, that is just evidence that this system is not working. So we're wasting money, we're wasting food, we're not serving people well, and we are contributing to climate change. And there's just too many problems in one to not do something.
Um, you also believe that chefs should be concerned with how people are eating all of the time, not just when they're at our
Yeah.
tables. Why? Once they leave, why do you care?
Yeah, because what we do has got to be about more than just a financial transaction, right? The hospitality, the guest and host dynamic existed before we paid money for meals, right? This was about hosting people. This was about welcoming people in. And we as chefs, we do what we do because we love food, right? And hopefully, in some level, we love feeding people. And that connection between our hands and our skill and actually putting a plate of food in front of somebody is really alive. Then we have to care more about how people are eating when they're not sitting in our restaurants. We have to think more about how the kind of access that people have to food all the time. Mostly because we're the only people who think food is as important as we do, right? We do this because we love food, and the current set of circumstances in our food system is is dire, right? Our food needs a champion. Our food system needs some defending and some representation, and it just makes sense to me that chefs be at least the first people in line to do that work.
Well, you write something that I find very interesting because I think COVID-19 has taught us, has changed our relationship with food. Some of us deal with stress a different way, or maybe we're interested now in growing our own food. But I wanted to
Hmm.
read something that you wrote in the book. You write, the highly processed industrial food on our institutional menus, especially in hospitals, comes at the expense of the good, wholesome foods that our bodies actually need. What do you mean by this?
Well, there is. I think that we have to move our thinking here beyond just what we don't want to eat, like beyond just identifying the things on that tray that are undesirable, to recognize the fact that not only are we being presented with an undesirable thing that gets wasted, but that the things that we are not eating are a real problem. Right? Like I always say to people that you can have your steak and your red meat or whatever it is, but just put a pile of greens on the side, right? Eat some vegetables along with this. And so, but the sort of the depth of the system of industrial food that is served to people in hospitals and often in schools and prisons, it really eliminates the possibility of any fresh food, any real, honest, good food that people need to eat. It just eliminates the possibility of that ever reaching the plate. And that is sort of a barrier that I think we don't consider enough.
You think that food should be made from scratch and on site daily in institutions. Is
Yeah.
that too idealistic?
Maybe for the current scenario, but for actual reality, I really don't think it is. Right? Because the only reason it seems untenable is because we have decided that the amount that we are willing to invest in our food is so tiny. Right? These budgets have shrunk down to a fraction of their original selves, not because of anything other than the fact that we just decided we didn't want to spend money this way. And that connects right to every other element of our lives. This is not a peculiarity in institutions. This is everywhere. We hardly spend any of our income, right? The World Health Organization suggests that between like 11 and 16% of household income should be spent on food. And right now in North America, we're sitting at like 8 or 9%, right? We just don't invest our time. People ask me, they want the fastest, quickest, easiest recipe because they want to spend as little time as possible in the kitchen. We want something for nothing. You know what I mean? We want to make withdrawals without making deposits in this scenario. And so the only way food is going to change is if we reprioritize it and reinvest in it.
I want to push back a little bit because even with
Yeah,
COVID-19 turning the world
please.
upside down,
Yep.
budgets are stretched really thin. So
Uh-huh.
if you're someone, a policymaker, and you have the difficult decision whether you're going to invest money into infrastructure or into personnel, into staff, and food is food. How do you have to manage? Something has to give, doesn't it?
Yep. Yep. Well, I mean, the thing is, it's sort of a ludicrous equation to begin with, right? It's about $845 approximately, my last check, for the cost of a hospital bed in Ontario. And we spend less than $10 a day on food ingredients for a patient, right? And even just that ratio is really off. However, if we think broader about it, when now that I've been in there and I've done some experiments and I've tested things and I've sort of massaged the budgets and tried to make it work, I have discovered that for a tiny increase, I'm talking an additional 33 cents on one meal per patient. I for better food ingredients, I can give you an exponentially better meal, right? So it is essentially it's this. You boost 11 or $12 even we're looking to spend on food ingredients for a patient could potentially save having to spend another 845 per day, right, for time in the hospital. This is sort of the holy grail that we chase, is a shortened patient stay in the hospital. And that correlation really does exist. We don't think about preventative health. We don't think about all the small investments that we can make now to prevent having to spend huge amounts of money by the time disease sets in, or we think about only therapeutic interventions for people. And that is the broader thinking that I really want people to connect to, right? The slashing and burning of budgets that we've seen over the course of the last 30 years has been really momentary and short-sighted. We haven't really understood what this has meant. And so my argument is that this investment now will actually allow us to save more money in the future and do a much better job of feeding people and collectively promoting health and wellness.
You also make the argument for the need for cultural diversity in food offerings at
Yeah.
hospitals. Dal and rice, congee, jerk
Mhm.
chicken. I'm getting hungry.
Yeah.
Is it possible to have that wide range of a menu for options for people in the hospitals?
It is absolutely possible. Easier when you have a kitchen that is nimble enough to cook food from scratch, right? That's an important consideration. I think that these things go hand in hand.
But why is it
Uh,
important to do?
well, because then we the food that we serve needs to be familiar, right? Especially when you're healing, it needs to be something that you are connected to, right? I remember visiting a patient, and I talk about this in the book. I visited an adult patient who had had a stroke, and his daughter was there, and she was holding up a tuna salad sandwich to his mouth for him to take bites. And I asked him, I said, "Sir, can you tell me, have you ever eaten a tuna salad sandwich before? And he said, no, never. And he said, also in my culture, applesauce is not a thing, is not a food, right? And he got a cup of applesauce, but didn't even recognize it, right? And I like, there's two sides to this. One is if you know the the cultural breakdown of the population you're serving, particularly in Scarborough, it's very known, the collection of cultures that we have, of folks living over there. Then why don't we serve that food? Why don't we think about what Chinese folks feed to people when they're convalescing? In my culture, it's dal and rice. In Chinese culture, it's congee. It's simple preparations, but isn't the thing that you want when you are sick something familiar, right? And something that you recognize from your culture? The other sort of potentially really troublesome side of it too is this weird imposition, right? There's sort of colonial underpinnings around the idea that we are going to serve everybody beef stroganoff in a hospital. I don't know the last time anybody really eats beef stroganoff. It's a throwback from my like 1970s era cooking school manual. You know what I mean? As sort of like a list of recipes to make. But that's not who we are. Right. And when I asked this man, I said, how would you feel if I could give you a plate of dal and rice? He was a South Asian man. I said, and he was like, can you? I would love that right now. And I was like, oh, sorry, I brought it up, friend. I can't actually do this right now. I don't think we understand the damaging message that gets sent with things like Salisbury steak and beef stroganoff and weird glazed chicken to people of non-European cultures for whom that is not familiar at all.
Well, how does prison food compare to hospital food?
It is quite similar. Obviously, there's the hospital food gets complicated around the therapeutic diets and that sort of thing. But what I really, and I haven't worked in a prison, but I actually was wonderfully able to communicate with the partner of an inmate currently in a prison here in Ontario. And just the other reading that I've done, because I've connected with some of the folks who do the feeding. And when I have done the research and learned, I've understood that while the food may be similar, perhaps more similar to what you see in a school cafeteria, the context and the delivery is where the real indignity and dehumanization begins,
What
right?
do you
Because,
mean?
well, prisons are the only institution where punishment is sort of is above board and allowed, right? That's kind of the whole point. This punitive relationship that that administration has with inmates is very particular to prisons, and it's very clear that the use of food in meal times is a delivery mechanism of this punishment, right? Because we see what I heard a lot from this one woman was ideas about the fact that menus would get printed and things would be posted, but very rarely would that ever be what shows up. And anytime anybody asked a question about this, they were told, you eat what you get and you shut up or you get nothing, right? There was lots of very dismissive gestures about how trays were put down. It seemed to be that the entire context of mealtime was delivering that reinforced message of punishment. And I happen to believe that when you are a prisoner, it does not mean that you have surrendered your humanity. I think that human rights still need to be maintained and defended in a prison, and the delivery of food is a really sort of anchor lever that can get pulled in this context. And I really want to push back on that because I don't think it's appropriate. And I think that we can appropriately punish people for doing terrible things without denying them the ability to stay alive properly, which is really about what this dismissive garbage food service is all about.
So bad food shouldn't be considered part of the punishment.
No, not at all.
Um,
Not at all.
what is the food like in schools?
The food in schools is a wide spectrum of things, right? My secondary schools, and so generally it's there's third party operators that are on campuses, and listen, the real complaint that we hear is the food is not great, the prices are really high, it's not nutritionally the way it needs to be, and there's no real connection to the campus or the community, no transparency, students don't get input on how these contracts are given out. And it's a really dead food culture, really, is the way I've chosen to recognize it.
What does that mean, dead food culture?
It means that food doesn't actually live in this place, right? It's just a thing that is used because it has to be there because some people live on site. So technically, we're required to have some sort of feeding, but the food is just about putting calories in the tank. There's nothing else. No connection to where it was grown, how it was cooked, and what the intentions are for how it's actually going to nurture your body. All of that does not exist. And so part of the work that I do and what I want to use this book to do is to broaden people's understanding of the fact that we need to invest in rebuilding food cultures. It is not just the problem that we are addressing here is not just about what's on the plates, right? If it was just about recipes and shopping and where we were buying ingredients from, we would have solved this a while ago. But the issue here is about the level of priority that food gets. It's about how important we think food is and how it can actually, right, nurture health and wellness or educational, academic excellence or rehabilitation in the context of prisons.
Because even when we talk about schools, you think that kids should be eating. It doesn't matter if you're at university or if you're in grade school; they should be
Yep.
eating nutritious food. How did it get to a point where it's become not even an issue to think about?
Uh, to me, this is the source of this is really about cuts in our budgeting, right? 30 years ago in this province specifically, we were at the mercy of a pretty, heavy handed slashing and burning of public budgets, specifically around health and education. Right. I was a teenager in high school at the time, and I remember that happening in my context as a high school student. But part of what happened there was I will argue that an already low priority around food was what saw the fat that existed to be trimmed, right? We are like, this isn't important. These are frills. These are things that are not required for the actual service that we're trying to provide, the healthcare, the education, however it is. And that's where it started. And obviously, we all know that once a budget gets gutted and people figure it out, that budget never gets replenished again.
You write about a time where you served food at a community food center, and you write that your meal service was an activist act of resistance. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, in a landscape, particularly at a community food center where you have a food bank, right, and you have emergency dining programs, be it a lunch program or breakfast programs. The food that is there is almost exclusively food that comes via donations, right? Via the food that we put in bins in the grocery stores, at Thanksgiving, or other sort of larger donations that come from grocery stores and corporations and things like that. And it is very processed food, largely, really highly processed food. And the most impactful piece in the context of vulnerable folks living with poverty is that that really contributes to a cycle of poor health and malnutrition, right? We don't ever get to break the cycle somehow. And so what I realized was that by me sort of trying to intercept this and really finding ways to put fresh, scratch made food that actually had some nourishment in it onto those plates was quite revolutionary,
Mm.
right? And we saw it. The response that we got from people was they were very surprised at the idea that they were actually getting a plate full of fresh food, right? And like, oh man,
That's gonna break
the,
your
the
heart as a
it really does.
yeah.
Because I realized the food on the plate is one thing, but what I would hear from community members is that they haven't had a meal where somebody put care and thought and attention into it, right? And that's what really gets my heart. That's why I do what I do, because
Mm.
it's really not a lot of effort for me to put some good thought and nice intention into a plate of food to offer somebody, especially if I know this is likely the only meal they're going to get in the day, right? And to me, to realize that the charity model that we have that we're working through specifically around food insecurity, it never breaks, right? There's never an opportunity where we sever that pattern and try to do things differently. And so I was really adamant about the fact that my kitchen and my meal service was at least a break from that, because the rest of people's lives are shrouded with this, right? If you are somebody who lives with poverty and food insecurity, your life is not easy. And there's a lot of other structures, be it the bureaucracy or the waiting in lines or the inhuman sort of lineup confessing, the fact that you don't have the means to care for yourself and your family. Let's give people a break. Let's let people have a reminder of their own humanity and support some dignity in just the simple act of offering people a good plate of food.
And when you said humanity, it made me think of something that you wrote in the book, The Origins of Hospitality. Can you quickly give us an explanation of that?
Yeah, it is. Okay, so when I was working in hospitals, I couldn't let go, right, of this idea. And I was like, hospitals, hospitality, these two must be connected to each other someplace, right? So I did some digging and I discovered that the word hospitality comes from hospes, right, which is a Latin word for stranger. Right. And then this got really interesting. And so more digging surfaced the idea that there were sort of a practice of these guest houses or these public houses where people would go and be well received, right? And this is what started this notion of a relationship between a guest and a host, right? People would arrive and there would sort of be assessed. You know, a little triage was done, and most often they were offered something to eat that would balance out wherever they were, right? If they were cold and they were hungry, a warm bowl of soup and some bread would be the thing to serve, you know what I mean, to take care of that. And then the religious community took that over, which is why we see lots of, you know, churches and places of worship connected to this kind of welcoming in of strangers or whoever just needs some comfort or a meal. And then now we see the medical community. But to imagine that hospitals in their earliest form were places where people came to get hospitality was like, that blew my mind. And I remember standing in the atrium of a hospital being like, how am I going to pull these two things back together again? You know, how are we going to pull this off? Because it just seems like they have really taken major strides apart.
I think your book is a way forward with that. Thank you so much for spending time with us and for the questions that you've raised in your book. It's given us a lot to consider. Thank you so much, Joshna.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for this time.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.